The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 2, Side 1. They turned to finance. In a hostile environment where popular violence might destroy or royal cupidity confiscate their immovable goods, the Jews were forced to the conclusion that their savings should be in liquid and mobile form. They took first to the simple business of money-changing, then to receiving money for commercial investment, then to lending money at interest. The Pentateuch and the Talmud had forbidden this among Jews, but not between Jew and non-Jew. As economic life grew more complex and the need for financing became more acute with the expansion of commerce and industry, the Jews lent one another money through a Christian intermediary or through silent partnerships in an enterprise and its profits, a device allowed by the rabbis and several Christian theologians. Since both the Quran and the Church forbade the charging of interest, and Christian moneylenders were consequently scarce before the 13th century, Muslim and Christian borrowers, including ecclesiastics, churches, and monasteries, applied to Jews for loans. So Aaron of Lincoln financed the building of 9 Cistercian monasteries and the great abbey of St. Albans. In the 13th century, Christian bankers invaded the field, adopted the methods that had been developed by the Jews, and soon surpassed them in wealth and range. The Christian usurer, although he did not have to safeguard himself to anything like the same extent against the chances of murder and pillage, was no less exacting than the Jew. Both alike pressed the debtor with Roman severity, and the kings exploited them all. All moneylenders were subject to high taxation, and in the case of the Jews to occasional outright confiscation. The kings made it a principle to allow high interest rates and periodically to squeeze the profits out of the financiers. The cost of collection was high, and in many cases the creditor had to bribe officials to allow him to capture his due. In 1198, Innocent III commanded all Christian princes, in preparation for the Fourth Crusade, to compel full remission of interest demanded of Christians by Jews. Louis IX, the saintly King of France, for the salvation of his own soul and those of his ancestors, freed all his subjects from a third of whatever they owed to Jews. English kings on occasion granted letters of release, cancelling interest or principal or both to subjects owing money to Jews. Not rarely the kings sold such letters, and noted in their registers the sums they received for their vicarious philanthropy. The British government required a copy of every loan agreement. An exchequer of the Jews was formed to file and supervise these agreements, and to hear cases concerning them. When a Jewish banker could not meet the taxes or levies laid upon him, the government, checking its record of his loans, confiscated all or part of them and notified the debtors to pay not the lender but the government. When in 1187 Henry II levied a special tax upon the people of England, the Jews were compelled to pay 1/4, the Christians 1/10, of their property. Nearly half the entire tax was paid by the Jews. At times, the Jews financed the kingdom. In 1210, King John ordered all Jews in England, men, women, and children, to be imprisoned. A tallage of 66,000 marks was taken from them. Those suspected of concealing the full amount of their hoards were tortured by having a tooth pulled out each day till they confessed. In 1230, Henry III, charging that the Jews had clipped the coin of the realm, apparently some had, confiscated a third of all the movable property of the English Jews. The operation having proved profitable, it was repeated in 1239. 2 years later, 20,000 silver marks were exacted from the Jews. 60,000 marks, a sum equal to the whole yearly revenue of the crown, were exacted in 1244. When Henry III borrowed 5,000 marks from the Earl of Cornwall, he consigned to him all the Jews of England as security. A series of imposts from 1252 to 1255 drove the Jews to such desperation that they begged permission to leave England en masse. Permission was refused. In 1275, Edward I strictly prohibited lending and interest. Loans continued nevertheless, and as the risk was greater, interest rates rose. Edward ordered all Jews in England arrested and their goods seized. Many Christian lenders were also arrested, and 3 of them were hanged. Of the Jews, 280 were hanged, drawn, and quartered in London. There were additional executions in the counties, and the property of hundreds of Jews was confiscated to the state. In the uneasy intervals between confiscations, the Jewish bankers prospered, and some became too visibly rich. They not only advanced capital to build castles, cathedrals, and monasteries, but they raised for themselves substantial houses. In England their homes were among the first dwellings built of stone. There were rich and poor among the Jews, despite Rabbi Eliezer's dictum that all men are equal before God, women and slaves, rich and poor. The rabbis sought to mitigate poverty and check profiteering wealth by a variety of economic regulations. They emphasized the responsibility of the group for the welfare of all, and softened the stings of adversity with organized charity. They did not denounce riches, but they succeeded in giving to learning a prestige equal to that of wealth. They branded monopoly and corners as sins. They forbade the retailer to profit by more than a sixth of the wholesale price. They watched over weights and measures. They fixed maximum prices and minimum wages. Many of these regulations failed. The rabbis could not isolate the economic life of the Jews from that of their neighbors in Islam or Christendom, and the law of supply and demand of goods and services found a way around all legislation. 3. Morals. The rich tried to atone for their accumulations by abundant charity. They acknowledged the social obligations of wealth, and perhaps they feared the curse or fury of the poor. No Jew is known to have died of hunger while living in a Jewish community. Periodically, and as early as the 2nd century after Christ, each member of the congregation, however poor, was assessed by official overseers for a contribution to the kuppah, or community chest, which took care of the old, poor, or sick, and the education and marriage of orphans. Hospitality was accorded freely, especially to wandering scholars. In some communities, incoming travelers were billeted in private homes by officers of the congregation. Jewish philanthropic societies grew to a great number as the Middle Ages advanced. Not only were there many hospitals, orphanages, poorhouses, and homes for the aged, but there were organizations providing ransoms for prisoners, dowries for poor brides, visits to the sick, care for destitute widows, and free burial for the dead. Christians complained of Jewish greed and tried to stir Christians to charity by citing the exemplary generosity of the Jews. Class differences disported themselves in dress, diet, speech, and 100 other ways. The simple Jew wore a long-sleeved and girdled robe or kaftan, usually black as if in mourning for his ruined temple and ravished land. But in Spain the well-to-do Jews proclaimed their prosperity with silks and furs, and the rabbis deplored in vain the handle given to hostility and discontent by such displays. When the king of Castile banned finery and raiment, the Jewish males obeyed, but continued to array their wives in splendor. When the king demanded an explanation, they assured him that the royal gallantry could never have meant the restrictions to apply to women, and the Jews continued throughout the Middle Ages to robe their ladies well. But they forbade them to appear in public with uncovered hair. Such an offense was ground for divorce, and the Jew was instructed not to pray in the presence of a woman whose hair was visible. The hygienic features of the law alleviated the effects of congested settlements. Circumcision, the weekly bath, the prohibition of wine or putrid meat as food, gave the Jews superior protection against diseases rampant in their Christian vicinities. Leprosy was frequent among the Christian poor, who ate salted meat or fish, but was rare among the Jews. Perhaps for like reasons, the Jews suffered less than Christians from cholera and kindred ailments. But in the slums of Rome, infested with mosquitoes from the Campagna marshes, Jew and Christian alike shivered with malaria. The moral life of the medieval Jew reflected his Oriental heritage and his European disabilities. Discriminated against at every turn, pillaged and massacred, humiliated and condemned for crimes not his own, the Jew, like the physically weak everywhere, resorted to cunning in self-defense. The rabbis repeated again and again that to cheat a Gentile is even worse than to cheat a Jew, but some Jews took the chance, and perhaps Christians too bargained as shrewdly as they knew. Some bankers, Jewish or Christian, were ruthless in their resolve to be paid, though doubtless there were in the Middle Ages, as in the 18th century, money-lenders as honest and faithful as Meyer Anselm of the Rote Schild. Certain Jews and Christians clipped coins or received stolen goods. The frequent use of Jews in high financial office suggests that their Christian employers had confidence in their integrity. Of violent crimes, murder, robbery, rape, the Jews were seldom guilty. Drunkenness was rarer among them in Christian than in Moslem lands. Their sex life, despite a background of polygamy, was remarkably wholesome. They were less given to pederasty than other peoples of Eastern origin. Their women were modest maidens, industrious wives, prolific and conscientious mothers, and early marriage reduced prostitution to a human minimum. Bachelors were rarities. Rabbi Asher ben Yehiel ruled that a bachelor of 20, unless absorbed in study of the law, might be compelled to marry by the court. Marriages were arranged by the parents. Few girls, says a Jewish document of the 11th century, were indelicate or impudent enough to express their own fancies or preference. But no marriage was fully legal without the consent of both parties. The father might give his daughter in marriage in her early years, even at 6. But such child marriages were not consummated till maturity, and when the daughter came of age, she could annul it if she wished. The betrothal was a formal act, making the girl legally the man's wife. They could not thereafter separate except by a bill of divorce. At the betrothal, a contract, or ketubah, was signed for the dowry and the marriage settlement. The latter was a sum set aside out of the husband's estate to be paid his wife in case the husband should divorce her or die. Without a marriage settlement of at least 200 zuzas, which could buy a one-family house, no marriage with a virgin bride was valid. Polygamy was practiced by rich Jews in Islamic lands, but was rare among the Jews of Christendom. Post-Talmudic rabbinical literature refers 1,000 times to a man's wife, never to his wives. About the year 1000, Rabbi Gershom ben Judah of Mainz decreed the excommunication of any polygamous Jew, and soon thereafter, in all Europe except Spain, polygamy and concubinage became almost extinct among the Jews. Cases continued to occur, however, where a wife, barren for 10 years after marriage, allowed her husband to take a concubine or an additional wife. Parentage was vital. The same decree of Gershom abolished the old right of the husband to divorce his wife without her consent or guilt. Divorces were probably less frequent in medieval Jewry than in modern America. Despite the comparative looseness of the marriage bond in law, the family was the saving center of Jewish life. External danger brought internal unity, and hostile witnesses testified to the warmth and dignity, thoughtfulness, consideration, parental and fraternal affection that marked and mark the Jewish family. The young husband, merged with his wife in work, joy, and tribulation, developed a profound attachment for her as part of his larger self. He became a father, and the children growing up around him stimulated his reserve energies and engaged his deepest loyalties. He had probably known no woman carnally before marriage, and had, in so small and intimate a community, few chances for infidelity afterward. Almost from their birth he saved to provide a dowry for his daughters and a marriage settlement for his sons, and he took it for granted that he should support them in the early years of their married life. This seemed wiser than to let youth prepare with a decade of promiscuity for the restrictions of monogamy. In many cases the bridegroom came to live with the bride in her father's home, seldom to the increment of happiness. The authority of the oldest father in the home was almost as absolute as in Republican Rome. He could excommunicate his children, and might beat his wife within reason. If he seriously injured her, the community fined him to the limit of his resources. Usually his authority was exercised with a sternness that never quite concealed a passionate love. The position of women was legally low, morally high. Like Plato, the Jew thanked God that he had not been born a woman, and the woman replied humbly, "I thank God that I was made according to his will." In the synagogue the women occupied a separate place in the gallery or behind the men, a clumsy complement to their distracting charms, and they could not be counted toward making a quorum. Songs in praise of a woman's beauty were considered indecorous, though the Talmud allowed them. Flirtation, if any, was by correspondence. Public conversation between the sexes, even between man and wife, was forbidden by the rabbis. Dancing was permitted, but only of woman with woman, of man with man. While the husband was by law the sole heir of his wife, the widow did not inherit from her husband. When he died, she received the equivalent of her dowry and the marriage settlement. For the rest, her sons, the natural heirs, were relied upon to support her decently. Daughters inherited only in the absence of sons, otherwise they had to depend upon brotherly affection, which seldom failed. Girls were not sent to school. In their case, a little knowledge was accounted an especially dangerous thing. However, they were allowed to study privately. We hear of several women who gave public lectures on the law, though sometimes the lecturer screened herself from her audience. Despite every physical and legal disadvantage, the deserving Jewish woman received after marriage full honor and devotion. Judah ben Moses ibn Tibbon, in 1170, quoted approvingly a Moslem sage, "None but the honorable honor women, none but the despicable despise them." The parental relation was more nearly perfect than the marital. The Jew, with the vanity of the commonplace, prided himself on his reproductive ability and his children. His most solemn oath was taken by laying his hand upon the testes of the man receiving the pledge, hence the word testimony. Every man was commanded to have at least 2 children. Usually there were more. The child was reverenced as a visitor from heaven, a very angel become flesh. The father was reverenced almost as a vicar of God. The son stood in the father's presence until bidden to be seated, and gave him a solicitous obedience that fully comported with the pride of youth. In the ceremony of circumcision the boy was dedicated to Yahweh by the covenant of Abraham, and every family felt obligated to train one son for the rabbinate. When the boy had completed his 13th year, he was received into manhood and into all the obligations of the law by a solemn ceremony of confirmation. The religion cast its awe and sanctity over every stage of development and eased the tasks of parentage. 4. Religion. In like manner, religion stood as a spiritual policeman over every phase of the moral code. Doubtless loopholes were found in the law, and legal fictions were concocted to restore the freedom of adaptation indispensable to an enterprising people. But apparently the medieval Jew accepted the law, by and large, as a bulwark saving him not only from eternal damnation, but, more visibly, from group disintegration. It harassed him at every turn, but he honored it as the very home and school of his growth, the vital medium of his life. Every home in Judaism was a church, every school was a temple, every father was a priest. The prayers and ritual of the synagogue had their briefer counterparts in the home. The fasts and festivals of the faith were celebrated there with educative ceremonies that bound the present with the past, the living with the dead and the yet unborn. Every Friday eve of the Sabbath, the father called his wife, children, and servants around him, blessed them individually, and led them in prayer, religious readings, and sacred songs. To the doorpost of each major room was attached a tube, or mezuzah, containing a parchment roll inscribed with 2 passages from Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, and chapter 11, verses 13 through 21, reminding the Jew that his God is one, and must be loved with all thy heart and soul and strength. From the age of 4, the child was brought to the synagogue, and there religion was impressed upon him in his most formative years. The synagogue was not merely a temple, it was the social center of the Jewish community. Synagogue, like ecclesia, synod, and college, meant an assemblage, a congregation. In pre-Christian days it had been essentially a school. It is still called shula by Ashkenazic Jews. In the dispersion it took on a strange variety of functions. In some synagogues it was the custom to publish on the Sabbath the decisions reached by the Beth Din during the week, to collect taxes, advertise lost articles, accept complaints of one member against another, and announce the coming sale of property so that any claimant on it might protest the sale. The synagogue dispensed communal charity, and in Asia served as a lodging for travelers. The building itself was always the finest in the Jewish quarter. Sometimes, especially in Spain and Italy, it was an architectural masterpiece, expensively and lovingly adorned. Christian authorities repeatedly forbade the erection of synagogues equaling in height the tallest Christian church in the city. In 1221, Pope Honorius III ordered the destruction of such a synagogue in Bourges. Seville had 23 synagogues in the 14th century. Toledo and Cordova almost as many. One built in Cordova in 1315 is now maintained as a national monument by the Spanish government. Every synagogue had a school, Beth HaMidrash, house of study, the Arabic madrasa. In addition, there were private schools and personal tutors. Probably there was a higher relative literacy among the medieval Jews than among the Christians, though lower than among the Muslims. Teachers were paid by the community or the parents, but all were under communal supervision. Boys went off to school at an early hour, in winter before dawn. Some hours later they returned home for breakfast, then they went back to school till 11, then home for lunch, back to school at noon, a respite between 2 and 3, then more schooling till evening. Then at last they were released to their homes for supper, prayers, and bed. Life was a serious matter for the Jewish boy. Hebrew and the Pentateuch were the primary studies. At the age of 10, the student took up the Mishnah. At 13, the major tractates of the Talmud. Those who were to be scholars continued the study of Mishnah and Gemara from 13 to 20 or later. Through the diversity of subjects in the Talmud, the student received a smattering of a dozen sciences, but almost nothing of non-Jewish history. There was much learning by repetition. The chorus of recitation was so vigorous that some localities excluded schools. Higher education was given in the yeshiva, or academy. The graduate of such an academy was called Talmid Hakam, scholar of the law. He was usually freed from community taxes, and though he was not necessarily a rabbi, all non-scholars were expected to rise on his coming or going. The rabbi was teacher, jurist, and priest. He was required to marry. He was paid little or nothing for his religious functions. Usually he earned a living in the secular world. He seldom preached. This was left to itinerant preachers, or magidim, schooled in sonorous and frightening eloquence. Any member of the congregation might lead it in prayer, read the scriptures, or preach. Usually, however, this honor was granted to some prominent or philanthropic Jew. Prayer was a complex ceremony for the Orthodox Hebrew. To be properly performed, it required that he should cover his head as a sign of reverence, strap upon his arms and his forehead small cases containing passages from Exodus and Deuteronomy, and wear on the borders of his garments fringes inscribed with the basic commandments of the Lord. The rabbis explained these formalities as necessary reminders of the unity, presence, and laws of God. Simple Jews came to look upon them as magical amulets, possessed of miraculous powers. The culmination of the religious service was reading from the scroll of the law, contained in a little ark above the altar. The Jews of the dispersion at first frowned upon music in religion as hardly suited to a mood of grief for their lost home. But music and religion are as intimately related as poetry and love. The deepest emotions require, for their civilized expression, the most emotional of the arts. Music returned to the synagogue through poetry. In the 6th century, the Paitanim, or non-Hebraic poets, began to write religious verse, confused with acrostic and alliterative artificialities, but uplifted with the resounding splendor of Hebrew, and filled with that religious ardor which in the Jew now served for both patriotism and piety. The crude but powerful hymns of Eliezer ben Kalir, from the 8th century, still find a place in some synagogue rituals. Similar poetry appeared among the Jews of Spain, Italy, France, and Germany. One such hymn is sung by many Jews on the Day of Atonement. With the coming of thy kingdom, the hills shall break into song, and the islands laugh exultant that they to God belong. And all their congregations so loud thy praise shall sing, that the farthest peoples, hearing, shall hail thee crowned King. When such piyutim, or sacred poems, were introduced into the synagogue service, they were sung by a precentor, and music re-entered the ritual. Furthermore, the scriptural readings and the prayers were in many synagogues chanted by a cantor, or by the congregation in a cantillation, whose musical tones were largely improvised, but occasionally followed patterns set in the plain song of the Christian chant. From the singing school of the monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland, at some time before the 11th century, came the complex chant for the famous Hebrew song Kol Nidri, All Vows. The synagogue never fully replaced the temple in the heart of the Jew. The hope that he might someday offer sacrifice to Yahweh before the Holy of Holies on Zion's hill inflamed his imagination and left him open to repeated deception by false messiahs. About 720, Cyrene, a Syrian, announced himself to be the expected Redeemer and organized a campaign to recapture Palestine from the Muslims. Jews from Babylonia and Spain abandoned their homes to join his venture. He was taken prisoner, exposed as a charlatan by the Caliph Yazid II, and was put to death. Some 30 years later, Obadiah Abu Isa ben Ishaq of Isfahan led a similar revolt. 10,000 Jews took up the sword and fought bravely under his lead. They were defeated, Abu Isa was slain in battle, and the Isfahan Jews suffered indiscriminate punishment. When the First Crusade excited Europe, Jewish communities dreamed that the Christians, if victorious, would restore Palestine to the Jews. They awoke from this fantasy to a succession of pogroms. In 1160, David al-Rui aroused the Jews of Mesopotamia with the announcement that he was the Messiah and would restore them to Jerusalem and liberty. His father-in-law, fearing disaster for the Jews from such an insurrection, slew him in his sleep. About 1225, another Messiah appeared in southern Arabia and stirred the Jews to mass hysteria. Maimonides, in a famous letter to the south, exposed the impostor's claims and reminded the Arabian Jews of the death and destruction that had followed such reckless attempts in the past. Nevertheless, he accepted the Messianic hope as an indispensable support to the Jewish spirit in the dispersion, and made it one of the 13 principal tenets of the Jewish faith. 4. Anti-Semitism, 500 to 1306. What were the sources of the hostility between non-Jew and Jew? The main sources have ever been economic, but religious differences have given edge and cover to economic rivalries. The Muslims, living by Mohammed, resented the Jewish rejection of their prophet. The Christians, accepting the divinity of Christ, were shocked to find that his own people would not acknowledge that divinity. Good Christians saw nothing unchristian or inhuman in holding an entire people through many centuries responsible for the actions of a tiny minority of Jerusalem Jews in the last days of Christ. The Gospel of Luke told how throngs of Jews welcomed Christ into Jerusalem, how, when he carried his cross to Golgotha, there followed him a great company of people, and of women who also bewailed and lamented him, and how, after the crucifixion, all the people that came together to that sight smote their breasts. But these evidences of Jewish sympathy for Jesus were forgotten when, in every Holy Week, the bitter story of the Passion was related from 1,000 pulpits. Resentment flared in Christian hearts, and on those days the Israelites shut themselves up in their own quarter and in their homes, fearful that the passions of simple souls might be stirred to a pogrom. Around that central misunderstanding rose 1,000 suspicions and animosities. Jewish bankers bore the brunt of the hostility aroused by interest rates that reflected the insecurity of loans. As the economy of Christendom developed and Christian merchants and bankers invaded fields once dominated by Jews, economic competition fomented hate. And some Christian moneylenders actively promoted anti-Semitism. Jews in official positions, especially in the finance department of governments, were a natural target for those who disliked both taxes and Jews. Given such economic and religious enmity, everything Jewish became distasteful to some Christians, and everything Christian to some Jews. The Christian reproached the Jew for clannish exclusiveness, and did not excuse it as a reaction to discrimination and occasional physical assault. Jewish features, language, manners, diet, ritual, all seemed to the Christian eye offensively bizarre. The Jews ate when Christians fasted, fasted when Christians ate. Their Sabbath of rest and prayer had remained Saturday as of old, while that of the Christians had been changed to Sunday. The Jews celebrated their happy deliverance from Egypt in a Passover feast that came too close to the Friday on which Christians mourned the death of Christ. Jews were not allowed by their law to eat food cooked, to drink wine pressed, or to use dishes or utensils that had been touched by a non-Jew, or to marry any but a Jew. The Christian interpreted these ancient laws, formulated long before Christianity, as meaning that to a Jew everything Christian was unclean, and he retorted that the Israelite himself was not usually distinguished by cleanliness of person or neatness of dress. Mutual isolation begot absurd and tragic legends on both sides. Romans had accused Christians of murdering pagan children to offer their blood in secret sacrifice to the Christian God. Christians of the 12th century accused Jews of kidnapping Christian children to sacrifice them to Yahweh, or to use their blood as medicine or in the making of unleavened bread for the Passover feast. Jews were charged with poisoning the wells from which Christians drank, and with stealing consecrated wafers to pierce them and draw from them the blood of Christ. When a few Jewish merchants flaunted their opulence in costly raiment, the Jews as a people were accused of draining the wealth of Christendom into Jewish hands. Jewish women were suspected as sorceresses. Many Jews, it was thought, were in league with the devil. The Jews retaliated with like legends about Christians and insulting stories about the birth and youth of Christ. The Talmud counseled the extension of Jewish charity to non-Jews. Baya praised Christian monasticism. Maimonides wrote that the teachings of Christ and Mohammed tend to lead mankind toward perfection. But the average Jew could not understand these courtesies of philosophy, and returned all the hatred that he received. There were some lucid intervals in this madness. Ignoring state and church laws that forbade it, Christians and Jews often mingled in friendship, sometimes in marriage, above all in Spain and southern France. Christian and Jewish scholars collaborated, Michael Scott with Anatoly, Dante with Emmanuel. Christians made gifts to synagogues, and in Worms, a Jewish park was maintained through a legacy from a Christian woman. In Lyon, the market day was changed from Saturday to Sunday for the convenience of the Jews. Secular governments, finding the Jews an asset in commerce and finance, gave them a vacillating protection, and in several cases where a state restricted the public movements of Jews or expelled them from its territory, it was because it could no longer safeguard them from intolerance and violence. The attitude of the Church in these matters varied with place and time. In Italy, she protected the Jews as guardians of the law of the Old Testament, and as living witnesses to the historicity of the Scriptures and to the wrath of God. But periodically church councils, often with excellent intentions and seldom with general authority, added to the tribulations of Jewish life. The Theodosian Code of 439, the Council of Clermont of 535, and the Council of Toledo of 589 forbade the appointment of Jews to positions in which they could impose penalties upon Christians. The Council of Orleans of 538 ordered Jews to stay indoors in Holy Week, probably for their protection, and prohibited their employment in any public office. The Third Council of the Lateran, in 1179, forbade Christian midwives or nurses to minister to Jews. And the Council of Béziers, in 1246, condemned the employment of Jewish physicians by Christians. The Council of Avignon, in 1209, retaliated Jewish laws of cleanliness by enjoining Jews and harlots from touching bread or fruit exposed for sale. It renewed church laws against the hiring of Christian servants by Jews, and it warned the faithful not to exchange services with Jews, but to avoid them as a pollution. Several councils declared null the marriage of a Christian with a Jew. In 1222 a deacon was burned at the stake for accepting conversion to Judaism and marrying a Jewess. In 1234 a Jewish widow was refused her dower on the ground that her husband had been converted to Christianity, thereby voiding their marriage. The Fourth Council of the Lateran of 1215, arguing that at times through error Christians have relations with the women of Jews or Saracens, and Jews or Saracens with Christian women, ruled that Jews and Saracens of both sexes in every Christian province and at all times shall be marked off in the eyes of the public from other people through the character of their dress. After their 12th year they were to wear a distinctive color, the men on their hats or mantles, the women on their veils. This was in part a retaliation against older and similar laws of Moslems against Christians and Jews. The character of the badge was determined locally by state governments or provincial church councils. Ordinarily it was a wheel or circle of yellow cloth, some 3 inches in diameter, sewn prominently upon the clothing. The decree was enforced in England in 1218, in France in 1219, in Hungary in 1279. It was only sporadically carried out in Spain, Italy, and Germany before the 15th century, when Nicholas of Cusa and San Giovanni della Capistrano campaigned for its full observance. In 1219 the Jews of Castile threatened to leave the country en masse if the decree should be enforced, and the ecclesiastical authorities consented to its revocation. Jewish physicians, scholars, financiers, and travelers were often exempted from the decree. Its observance declined after the 16th century and ended with the French Revolution. By and large, the popes were the most tolerant prelates in Christendom. Gregory I, though so zealous for the spread of the faith, forbade the compulsory conversion of Jews and maintained their rights of Roman citizenship in lands under his rule. When bishops in Terracina and Palermo appropriated synagogues for Christian use, Gregory compelled them to make full restitution. To the Bishop of Naples he wrote, "Do not allow the Jews to be molested in the performance of their services. Let them have full liberty to observe and keep all their festivals and holy days, as both they and their fathers have done for so long." Gregory VII urged Christian rulers to obey conciliar decrees against the appointment of Jews. When Eugenius III came to Paris in 1145 and went in pomp to the cathedral, which was then in the Jewish quarter, the Jews sent a delegation to present him with the Torah, or scroll of the law. He blessed them, they went home happy, and the Pope ate a paschal lamb with the king. Alexander III was friendly to Jews and employed one to manage his finances. Innocent III led the Fourth Lateran Council in its demand for a Jewish badge, and laid down the principle that all Jews were doomed to perpetual servitude because they had crucified Jesus. In a softer mood he reiterated papal injunctions against forcible conversions, and added, "No Christian shall do the Jews any personal injury, or deprive them of their possessions, or disturb them during the celebration of their festivals, or extort money from them by threatening to exhume their dead." Gregory IX founder of the Inquisition, exempted the Jews from its operation or jurisdiction, except when they tried to Judaize Christians, or attacked Christianity, or reverted to Judaism after conversion to Christianity. And in 1235 he issued a bull denouncing mob violence against Jews. Innocent IV, in 1247, repudiated the legend of the ritual murder of Christian children by Jews. Certain of the clergy and princes, nobles, and great lords have falsely devised godless plans against the Jews, unjustly depriving them of their property by force and appropriating it to themselves. They falsely charge them with dividing among them on the Passover the heart of a murdered boy. In fact, in their malice, they ascribe to Jews every murder, wherever it chanced to occur. And on the ground of these and other fabrications they are filled with rage against them, rob them, oppress them by starvation, imprisonment, torture, and other sufferings, sometimes even condemning them to death, so that the Jews, though living under Christian princes, are in worse plight than were their ancestors under the Pharaohs. They are driven to leave in despair the land in which their fathers have dwelt since the memory of man. Since it is our pleasure that they shall not be distressed, we ordain that you behave toward them in a friendly and kind manner. Whenever any unjust attacks upon them come under your notice, redress their injuries, and do not suffer them to be visited in the future by similar tribulations. This noble appeal was widely ignored. In 1272, Gregory X had to repeat its denunciation of the ritual murder legend, and to give his words force he ruled that thereafter the testimony of a Christian against a Jew should not be accepted unless confirmed by a Jew. The issuance of similar bulls by later popes, till 1763, attests both the humanity of the popes and the persistence of the evil. That the popes were sincere is indicated by the comparative security of the Jews and their relative freedom from persecution in the Papal States. Expelled from so many countries at one time or another, they were never expelled from Rome or from Papal Avignon. Had it not been for the Catholic Church, writes a learned Jewish historian, the Jews would not have survived the Middle Ages in Christian Europe. Before the Crusades, the active persecution of Jews in medieval Europe was sporadic. The Byzantine emperors continued for 2 centuries the oppressive policies of Justinian toward the Jews. Heraclius in 628 banished them from Jerusalem in retaliation for their aid to Persia, and did all he could to exterminate them. Leo the Isaurian sought to disprove the rumor that he was Jewish by a decree in 723 giving Byzantine Jews a choice between Christianity or banishment. Some submitted, some burned themselves to death in their synagogues rather than yield. Basil I, from 867 to 886, resumed the campaign to enforce baptism upon the Jews, and Constantine VII, from 912 to 959, required from Jews in Christian courts a humiliating form of oath, more Judaico, which continued in use in Europe till the 19th century. When in 1095 Pope Urban II proclaimed the First Crusade, some Christians thought it desirable to kill the Jews of Europe before proceeding so far to fight Turks in Jerusalem. Godfrey of Bouillon, having accepted the leadership of the crusade, announced that he would avenge the blood of Jesus upon the Jews, and would not leave one of them alive. And his companions proclaimed their intention to kill all Jews who would not accept Christianity. A monk further aroused Christian ardor by declaring that an inscription found on the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem made the conversion of all Jews a moral obligation of all Christians. The Crusaders planned to move south along the Rhine, where lay the richest settlements in northern Europe. The German Jews had played a leading part in the development of Rhenish commerce, and had behaved with a restraint and piety that had won the respect of Christian laity and clergy alike. Bishop Rüdiger of Speyer was on cordial terms with the Jews of his district, and gave them a charter guaranteeing their autonomy and security. In 1095 the Emperor Henry IV issued a similar charter for all the Jews of his Rome. Upon these peaceful Jewish congregations the news of the crusade, its proposed route, and the threats of its leaders broke with paralyzing terror. The rabbis proclaimed several days of fasting and prayer. Arrived at Speyer, the Crusaders dragged 11 Jews into a church and ordered them to accept baptism. Refusing, the 11 were slain, this on May 3, 1096. Other Jews of the city took refuge with Bishop Johansen, who not only protected them but caused the execution of certain Crusaders who had shared in the murders at the church. As some Crusaders neared Trier, its Jews appealed to Bishop Egilbert. He offered protection on condition of baptism. Most of the Jews consented, but several women killed their children and threw themselves into the Moselle, this June 1st, 1096. At Mainz, Archbishop Ruthard hid 1,300 Jews in his cellars. Crusaders forced their way in and killed 1,014. The bishop was able to save a few by concealing them in the cathedral, this on May 27th, 1096. 4 Mainz Jews accepted baptism but committed suicide soon afterward. As the Crusaders approached Cologne, the Christians hid the Jews in their homes. The mob burned down the Jewish quarter and killed the few Jews upon whom they could lay their hands. Bishop Hermann, at great danger to himself, secretly conveyed the Jews from their Christian hiding places to Christian homes in the country. The pilgrims discovered the maneuver, hunted their prey in the villages, and killed every Jew they found, this in June 1096. In 2 of these villages, 200 Jews were slain. In 4 others, the Jews, surrounded by the mob, killed one another rather than be baptized. Mothers delivered of infants during these attacks slew them at birth. At Worms, Bishop Alabrancus received such of the Jews as he could into his palace and saved them. Upon the rest the Crusaders fell with the savagery of anonymity, killing many and then plundering and burning the homes of the Jews. Here many Jews committed suicide rather than repudiate their faith. 7 days later a crowd besieged the episcopal residence. The bishop told the Jews that he could no longer hold back the mob and advised them to accept baptism. The Jews asked to be left alone for a while. When the bishop returned, he found that nearly all of them had killed one another. The besiegers broke in and slew the rest. All in all, some 800 Jews died in this pogrom at Worms on August 20th, 1096. Similar scenes occurred at Metz, Regensburg, and Prague. The Second Crusade of 1147 threatened to better the example of the first. Peter the Venerable, the saintly abbot of Cluny, advised Louis VII of France to begin by attacking the French Jews. "I do not require you to put to death these accursed beings. God does not wish to annihilate them, but like Cain the fratricide, they must be made to suffer fearful torments and be preserved for greater ignominy, for an existence more bitter than death." Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis protested against this conception of Christianity, and Louis VII contented himself with capital levies on rich Jews. But the German Jews were not let off with mere confiscation. A French monk, Rodolphe, leaving his monastery without permission, preached a pogrom in Germany. At Cologne, Simon the Pious was murdered and mutilated. At Speyer, a woman was tortured on the rack to persuade her to Christianity. Again, the secular prelates did all they could to protect the Jews. Bishop Arnold of Cologne gave them a fortified castle as refuge and allowed them to arm themselves. The Crusaders refrained from attacking the castle, but killed any unconverted Jew that fell into their clutches. Archbishop Henry at Mainz admitted into his house some Jews pursued by a mob. The mob forced a way in and killed them before his eyes. The archbishop appealed to St. Bernard, the most influential Christian of his time. Bernard replied with a strong denunciation of Rodolphe and demanded an end to violence against the Jews. When Rodolphe continued his campaign, Bernard came in person to Germany and forced the monk to return to his monastery. Shortly thereafter, the mutilated body of a Christian was found at Würzburg. Christians charged Jews with the crime, attacked them despite the protests of Bishop Embico, and killed 20. Many others, wounded, were tended by Christians, this in 1147, and the bishop buried the dead in his garden. From Germany, the idea of beginning the Crusades at home passed back to France, and Jews were massacred at Carentan, Ramreux, and Sully. In Bohemia, 150 Jews were murdered by Crusaders. After the terror had passed, the local Christian clergy did what it could to help the surviving Jews, and those who had accepted baptism under duress were allowed to return to Judaism without incurring the dire penalties of apostasy. These pogroms began a long series of violent assaults which continued till our time. In 1235 an unsolved murder at Baden was laid to the Jews, and a massacre ensued. In 1243 the entire Jewish population of Belitz, near Berlin, was burned alive on the charge that some of them had defiled a consecrated host. In 1283 the accusation of ritual murder was raised at Mainz, and despite all the efforts of Archbishop Werner, 10 Jews were killed and Jewish homes were pillaged. In 1285 a like rumor excited Munich. 180 Jews fled for refuge to a synagogue. The mob set fire to it, and all 180 were burned to death. A year later 40 Jews were killed at Oberwessel on the charge that they had drained the blood of a Christian. In 1298 every Jew in Rüttingen was burned to death on the charge of desecrating a sacramental wafer. Rindfleisch, a pious baron, organized and armed a band of Christians sworn to kill all Jews. They completely exterminated the Jewish community at Würzburg and slew 698 Jews in Nuremberg. The persecution spread, and in half a year 140 Jewish congregations were wiped out. The Jews of Germany, having repeatedly rebuilt their communities after such attacks, lost heart, and in 1286 many Jewish families left Mainz, Worms, Speyer, and other German towns, and migrated to Palestine to live in Islam. As Poland and Lithuania were inviting immigrants, and had not yet experienced pogroms, a slow exodus of Jews from the Rhineland began to the Slavic east.